Доброго дня, шановні.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ukrainian Crisis Media Center starts at work, and we welcome everybody who are watching us online and who has come to our briefing here. Our briefing is devoted to discussion about the achievements in gender equality policy within 30 years of Ukrainian independence. Yarina Yasenevich, one of the co-founders of charity association Women Can, and we have also Irina Soslova on Skype connection with us, and our project is carried out within the project on the framework of I believe that we should discuss this topic in the context of our heritage, in the context of our previous experiences, discussing the traditional values of the female of Ukrainian ethnicity in the past. Larissa. Today we have here those people who could be called the mothers, founders of Ukrainian female movement in late 20th century, and I would like to thank to these ladies, because today we clearly understand that the movement in Ukraine. Larissa, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this discussion. Let me come closer to the 30th anniversary of Ukrainian independence and recollect something from the year 1991. Today, finding ourselves in the midst of nostalgic reminiscences, quite often we look at the documented various professional women, so that wide spectrum, very colorful spectrum, and each color of that spectrum had passed through a long history. They studied the history, they formulated the agenda of the most topical issues for Ukraine at that time. They offered some projects which coincided with the agenda of the United Nations and the agenda of other international organizations, thus bringing Ukraine to the community of she became herself a role model for us. I would like to recollect another person, Ms. Lyudmila Smirnova, who was the international journalist. She was born in 1946, and at that time he made an attempt to play against the role model which was assigned to women at that time. She wrote a brilliant book about NATO, but the Moscow censors a lot of pictures in that book, and you almost cannot find women on those pictures, which today looks rather strange for us, but what impresses you most, that you see a lot of men in business suits and almost no female faces. So let us now recollect the challenges which women in 1991.
Well, participation for men and women and equality of rights for men and women was introduced, and Constitutional Council adopted this point and introduced changes to Article 20. First, there were only suits of men, and now we have many colors of women's attire, and we see many women in governmental structures and in the parliament. One of the requirements was to increase the number of women in the bodies of power of all levels, and the fight for quotas that ended recently. Before the last elections, we got changes to the law on elections with fixed quota. So the first four conference concerning women's issues, and the agenda was changed, and they focused more on gender policy, and there was a transformation from one side, and from the other, the focus was preserved concerning support of women's rights, and Ukraine participated actively in these processes. So I believe that this list is really extensive, and we'd like to continue our discussion, and we give the floor to Katerina. Thank you. So in 1990s, there were many challenges, and now we see that there was contradictions in perception concerning women's rights and how the state should implement this policy. So what I'm speaking about is that before independence, the head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was speaking about changes and reforms in society, and there was a slogan that was supported by the whole country, by many countries, to provide women with traditional responsibilities after Soviet era, after destruction and poverty and overload and many problems, motherhood, and this policy was promoted through this patriarchal paradigm, and we should change it because it is painful for many structures now. Elena will join us, and we will provide her the floor. And they now actively promote gender issues, and we met in the park, and there were a lot of people. And we paid attention to this group and about the problems we faced at the time. We had many of them. Now analysts think about these problems, but we had a simpler approach. We didn't have a wonderful building where we could get united. And newly created organizations, they didn't have their own premises. Now we also have such a problem, but there are many hubs and open spaces where you can meet. Next point is information. Someone went to Nairobi, and others, they only could see this city on the map. It was difficult to find any information. And I remember when I was sent a letter by the women's organization, and this was the they sent journals to me, and I made a pyramid of these journals in my one-room flat. Levko Lukyanenko was supported as the candidate for the president, and I asked them, how does it relate? And they said that Ukrainian Women's Union should promote this candidate. And for me, this was really impressive. This was a vulnerability. I'm an idealist to a large extent, but I understand that this is really difficult to be independent, to fight for your independence and to live independently. This is really important philosophic topic, because we considered minor things, and then our colleague shared with us that we should protect our borders concerning our state borders, and even in the activity of our women's organizations. So we continue to remind about the challenges in the activity of women's organization. And I give the floor to Svetlana to continue and to speak about lives of women in Ukraine 30 years ago.
It's not easy for me to recollect something from early 1990s because at that time I was not part of the process. My story in this moment started since early year 2000, but as Tamara Martsynyuk mentioned in one of her articles, we tried all this sideways to reach our bright dream. And civil society organizations were searching and looking for their own identity and trying to identify the future role in the new society. What Larissa mentioned, that factors became the catalyzers in implementation of that dream, and that became the platform for the foundation of the female organizations. When the government of Ukraine for the first time recognized the gender policy as one of its objectives, it was an important moment for us, but it happened only in 2017, rather late, I mean, and before that, all the long period between the independence and 2017, we did our hard work trying to bring this the focus of the state policy. Before summarizing the achievements of the 30 years, I would like to point out to one important book or the expert with white font on the white page, something like that. And reading that book, I was very much impressed with the stories of women who started the female movement, and at that time there was a big distance between self-identification. I am a Ukrainian and I am a woman, and how the preference was made in comparison between these two identities, in choosing between the two identities. I'm a Ukrainian and I'm a woman. Well, it was almost impossible to bring together these two identities. Of course, we clearly sensed the big distance between these two self-identities, and many women put the self-identity, I am Ukrainian, first. Even today, many of us understand that actually these two aspects of self-identity, they do not conflict with each other, but they do not fully coincide at the same time. In this context, I would point out to the highlight of one article which was called I'm a Ukrainian, I'm lesbian, and I'm an Australian. So there's two opposite meanings, the opposition between these two self-identities. It was existent 30 years ago, and even today it continues to exist. For example, the UN Convention against violence on violence against women, quite often the supporters of this convention are blamed for the non-patriotic behavior, and they are blamed in counteraction to the traditional Ukrainian values, without further discussion what those values are. And if we recollect the marches of Ukrainian women on the 8th of March and the slogans which were showed by the participants, that gender equality is a traditional inherited value of our society, and without this we cannot discuss the proper enjoyment of human rights. But when we discuss the human rights, when we quite often we sometimes exclude the female gender rights from that, and now you may find a new term, human female rights. Actually, this is a serious challenge to the human rights activists, to the civic activists in this country as a whole. Who would like to take the floor? When I recollect early 1990s, we clearly see that at that time people were very much preoccupied with the self-identification process. I clearly remember that when my students from Western Ukraine had come to the first lecture, and I entered the room and welcomed them in Ukrainian language, they started to applaud, because at that time even this a small thing was a surprise for them. and at that time, when people tried to reject from the Soviet past, to turn their faces from the Soviet past, and demonstrated this in communication in Ukrainian language, etc. This was perceived as bravery. And today, when we point out to the colorful spectrum of social views at that time, and when we discuss this opposition between I am Ukrainian and I am a woman, women tried to balance this opposition in new presentation, how the old patriarchal traditions could be overcome by new genderly equal approach. And of course, old patriarchal traditions, even today, is reflected in a very active dialogue about the role of women in society. And even today, when we observe how show women in Afghan television had radically changed their appearance within one day, we start to understand that everything in human rights remains rather vulnerable. And when somebody wishes to sacrifice some interests, these are the female interests, gender equality interests, which easily are sacrificed in seriously dangerous societal situations. And this brings us to the clear idea that we have stand for the interests of gender equality, female gender equality, very strongly and very firmly even today. Well, this brings us to the next issue, the actual discussion about achievements within this 30 years. We had mentioned the problems and challenges which we had been facing during that 30 years, but today, let us also point out to our achievements. What were the victories? What were the wins which we could mention? I am a lawyer by background and working as an ombudsman as to the equality policy, and I'm inclined to discuss the legislative framework related to gender equality. And I have to say that during that 30 years, we gradually have joined almost all the international treaties to gender equality. And here I have to remind you that the Convention on the Women's Equality was signed by Ukraine even in Soviet period, and we have joined a lot of treaties of the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and then later on cooperation with USC, OSCE. NATO, etc., resulted for us in recognition of the gender equality issues. And back in 1986, the Verkhovna Rada discussed possibility to pass the law anti-discrimination of women. And in mid-1990s, it was passed. In the year 2002, a law on the violence in households, domestic violence, was passed. At that time, that law was faced a lot of opposition from the traditionalists, so to say. We also recollect about the law about counteraction to discrimination, which sets the provisions against gender discrimination, also contributes to this general idea about equality. And all those moves were initiated by female organizations. They were main engines, main pushers of those political changes that were made at the legislative level.
Thank you very much. For me, I believe that I'm a happy person. I haven't faced this gender discrimination, but experience is a good teacher. And I would like to speak about the achievements. And I worked in AIDS convocation, and I would like to speak about the contribution of others. For me, this was a challenge and a big victory. Today, there was a presentation of the Fund of Democratic Initiatives, and they carried out a survey to mark the 30th anniversary of independence, and Ukrainians provide their answers about what was done. And first, me as a person who worked in politics and political parties, for me it was an important issue to adopt gender quotas in elections. This was a breakthrough that allowed to provide more equality at a local level, and also this was done for the national level, and this moved us forward to European values for many years ahead. And next, these were the laws concerning domestic violence. They provided the basis for ratification of the Istanbul Convention. Unfortunately, AIDS convocation was not able to do this. I'm sure that this story will be successfully resolved this year, and equal opportunities of this convocation, and our government and the president, they promised this, and this will be a big victory. I may name other documents that were adopted in times of independence. You know that economic gap and the salary gap remains 24-25%. And also prohibited professions for women, and the list of these professions was cancelled, and women now may get proper access to professions with high salaries, and they will be financially independent throughout their lives, and also during pension, because pensions depend on salaries. A lot has been done after the Maidan period, and this period of Russian aggression. During this period, a number of laws was approved to highlight the issues concerning women who serve in the army. Previously,